My father turned me into a human crash test dummy. Billionaires placed bets on how many bones I would shatter. I planned a stunt they would never see coming. How did your parents use you for money? Every Saturday night, my father would drive me to abandoned warehouses where wealthy perverts paid thousands of dollars to watch children perform death-defying stunts until someone got permanently injured. My father was a failed stunt coordinator who'd been blacklisted from Hollywood after a child actor died on his set. He discovered this underground circuit where rich sadists bet on which kids would suffer specific injuries during dangerous performances. Dad saw me as his ticket back to wealth and started training me when I was 8, making me practice falls from increasing heights onto concrete while he filmed to study my pain tolerance. He'd get aroused watching footage of children getting hurt and kept journals documenting which stunts caused the most spectacular injuries. Dad spent months conditioning me to ignore pain and fear by making me perform increasingly dangerous acts in our garage. He'd have me jump through rings of fire, walk on broken glass barefoot, and balance on beams while he threw objects at me. When I cried from burns or cuts, he'd lock me in a closet with videos of children dying in accidents, saying that's what happened to performers who showed weakness. He started inviting other parents from the circuit to evaluate my potential, and they'd make me demonstrate stunts while discussing how much audiences would pay to see a child my size fall from certain heights. When I was 10, Dad announced I was ready for the circuit and that my job was to perform stunts until something inside me broke for the entertainment of his clients. The warehouse events were organized like theater performances, where children were forced to attempt increasingly dangerous feats, while spectators placed bets on exactly how and when we'd get injured. The wealthy audience members could request specific stunts and pay premiums to see children attempt acts that virtually guaranteed permanent damage. Dad had already taken a signing bonus and promised them I'd deliver spectacular injuries. "You're going to make us rich," he said, "even if it kills you." The warehouse was set up like a twisted circus with multiple performance areas where children attempted deadly stunts simultaneously. Rich businessmen and politicians would move between stations, placing bets on which child would break which bones. My first performance involved jumping between platforms 30 feet high with no safety equipment while the crowd screamed for me to fall. I made it across but watched another girl miss a jump and shatter both legs on impact while spectators threw money at her writhing body. Dad was furious I hadn't fallen and made me attempt increasingly dangerous stunts until I finally mistimed a flip and broke my wrist. The crowd erupted in cheers as I screamed. Each week the stunts became deadlier and the injuries more severe. I watched kids forced to juggle knives until they severed fingers, walk tightropes over beds of nails until they fell and impaled themselves, and attempt motorcycle jumps that left them paralyzed. The spectators would request specific injuries like compound fractures or facial disfigurement and pay bonuses when children delivered exactly what they wanted. Dad would coach me on how to fall to maximize visible damage without dying because corpses didn't pay. After 3 months, I had burn scars covering my arms, a permanent limp from a shattered ankle, and partial hearing loss from an explosion stunt gone wrong. I reached my breaking point when they brought in a 7-year-old girl for her first performance, and I saw myself in her terrified eyes. That night, I refused to perform my scheduled stunt and instead grabbed the microphone to address the crowd. "You're all sick," I screamed at the spectators. "This is child torture and I have all your faces on video." I'd been secretly recording with a hidden camera for weeks and had footage of prominent businessmen and politicians cheering for children's injuries. The crowd panicked and started fleeing while Dad went insane with rage. For 2 weeks, I thought I'd won because the warehouse stayed empty and Dad couldn't force me back without his audience. I gave the footage to a journalist who promised to expose everyone involved. I moved in with my aunt and started attending school again, feeling like I'd finally escaped the nightmare. Dad called constantly with threats, but I ignored him, believing the evidence I'd gathered would protect me. But Dad wasn't giving up his income source that easily. He'd spent those 2 weeks organizing with other parents from the circuit who'd lost their cash flow. They tracked down the journalist and destroyed all copies of my footage before it could be published. Dad showed up at my aunt's house with forged custody papers and a corrupt judge's order granting him emergency custody due to my delinquent behavior. He dragged me back home where 5 other circuit parents were waiting. They explained that the stunts would continue, but in international waters where no laws applied. Dad had already accepted $1 million advance for me to perform the ultimate stunt that everyone knew would be fatal. "You cost us all money with your little rebellion," he said, showing me boat tickets. "Now you're going to pay us back with interest." They locked me in the basement with plans to transport me to the ship in 3 days. Through the walls, I could hear them discussing which collector had placed the highest bid for my body after the stunt failed. Dad came down with a syringe of sedatives and smiled. "The buyer specifically requested you arrive conscious enough to feel everything, so we're keeping you just barely lucid for the trip." The needle burned going in, and within seconds, everything started getting fuzzy around the edges. My legs went numb first, then my arms felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. I could still hear them talking upstairs through the heating vent, their voices mixing together as they planned which kids would go on which boat. Dad's voice cut through clearest, saying something about 6 kids total and needing to move them tomorrow night before anyone noticed they were gone. My brain tried to hold on to their words, but the drug made everything slip away like water. I forced myself to focus on memorizing the voices, counting 5 different adults up there planning our transport. Through the small basement window, I saw movement outside and my heart jumped when I recognized Lucas being dragged toward a white van by his mom. He'd lost 3 fingers during a knife juggling stunt 2 months ago and still had bandages on his hand. Our eyes locked for just a second and I saw him mouth the word help before his mom shoved him into the van and slammed the door. The sedative was making me dizzy, but I managed to crawl across the concrete floor to the heating vent where I could hear better. My bad ankle dragged behind me, sending sharp pains up my leg with every movement. Vincent Caruso's voice came through clear as he talked about destroying all the evidence from that journalist's laptop. They were tearing apart my room upstairs, looking for backup copies of the footage I'd taken. They didn't know I'd uploaded everything to a cloud account under a fake email address before giving the journalist his copies. I heard drawers slamming and furniture being moved as they searched. Hours passed in a blur of drifting in and out of consciousness. Dad came down with a plastic cup of water and a piece of stale bread, watching me with cold eyes as I struggled to sit up. He told me I'd cost him $3 million in lost revenue when I'd exposed the warehouse operation. operation. The buyers in Singapore were paying $5 million for my final performance, he said, checking my pulse to make sure I was weak but not dying. He left the bread just out of reach and went back upstairs. The house went quiet around midnight as they all left to make preparations. My fingers were clumsy from the drugs, but I remembered a trick another circuit kid had taught me before she died in a motorcycle stunt. I pulled a wire from my leg brace and started working on the basement window lock, my hands shaking as muscle memory took over. The lock clicked open after 20 minutes, but the window was painted shut from years of neglect. I used blood from a cut on my arm that had reopened to lubricate the paint, working the window frame back and forth. Every movement sent fire through my bad ankle, but I kept pushing. A door slammed upstairs and footsteps moved across the floor above me. Vincent's heavy boots approached the basement door, and I scrambled back to my corner, arranging my body to look unconscious. He came down the creaking stairs and checked my breathing, then made a phone call right there in the basement. He said the Morrison kid was ready for transport and asked about the other 5 kids. My heart pounded so hard I was sure he'd hear it as he listed Lucas's name, along with 4 other kids I recognized from the circuit. After Vincent left, I lay there thinking about my mom, Margaret Morrison, who'd seen Dad getting obsessed with dangerous stunts and left when I was 6. She'd tried to get custody, but Dad had better lawyers and convinced the judge she was unstable. I wondered if she even knew what had happened to me after Dad got custody. The house stayed quiet for hours, and around 3 in the morning I finally got the window open wide enough to squeeze through. My bad ankle screamed as I pulled myself up using the window frame. The motion sensor lights stayed dark because Dad had disabled them for tonight's activities. 3 white vans sat in the driveway, and I could see shapes moving inside the house. I dropped from the window and hit the ground hard, my ankle sending sharp pain up my leg as I stumbled toward the neighbor's fence. The van's engine started behind me, and I heard car doors slamming as I pushed through the hedge into Mrs. Peterson's yard. Her motion lights blazed on, and I saw her silhouette appear at her kitchen window before she grabbed her phone. What makes me wonder is how Dad managed to find this whole secret circuit of rich people who want to watch kids get hurt. There must be some really dark connections happening behind the scenes that we're not seeing here. I kept running through 3 more yards until I reached the main road, where a police cruiser was already pulling up, lights flashing. The officer jumped out and I collapsed against his car, gasping that there were kids in my house being taken. More sirens filled the air as patrol cars converged on our street, and I watched from the back of an ambulance as officers surrounded the house with weapons drawn. The vans tried to scatter, but police blocked every exit, and within minutes they had Vincent and 2 other men in handcuffs, while officers carried 3 kids out wrapped in blankets. At the station that afternoon, I sat in a small room drinking hot chocolate when Aunt Claire burst through the door. She pulled me into her arms, and I felt her tears on my hair as she kept saying she'd tried to get custody last year, but Dad had paperwork saying I was doing great. Her hands shook as she held me, and for the first time in months I felt safe enough to cry. Detective Torres came in and turned on the TV, where breaking news showed footage of Dad being dragged from our house in handcuffs. The reporter said police had uncovered a child exploitation ring, and the screen showed Vincent trying to run with 2 kids before officers tackled him. They'd rescued 3 of the 6 missing children, but were still searching for the others. Lucas arrived at the station an hour later with his left hand wrapped in thick bandages where they'd cut off 2 fingers. We sat on a bench in the hallway without talking, just understanding what we'd both survived. After a long silence, he looked at me and said there was a boat at Marina del Rey, Pier 47, where they were supposed to take us. Detective Torres immediately made calls, and within an hour the Coast Guard was racing toward the pier. The news showed helicopters circling a white yacht as Coast Guard boats surrounded it and officers boarded with guns drawn. They found 3 more kids locked in the cabin, including the 7-year-old girl from the warehouse, all alive but traumatized. The boat captain immediately asked for his lawyer, but the kids were safe and being taken to the hospital. One boy named David was still missing, and nobody knew where they'd taken him. That evening they moved me to a safe house with Aunt Claire, a normal-looking home in a quiet neighborhood with an alarm system and locks on every window. The house felt too clean and perfect after everything, and I kept checking behind doors and jumping at every car that passed. Claire made tomato soup, but my throat felt so tight I could barely swallow, knowing this wasn't really over. Detective Torres visited the next morning with a folder of photographs showing men in expensive suits at various events. She explained that several suspects had made bail already, including a police officer who'd been helping them, and they'd assigned protective details to all the victim families. I looked through the photos and recognized 6 men from the warehouse, including a federal judge whose face I'd never forget, and a CEO who'd paid extra to watch a boy break his arm. Torres's face got dark when I pointed them out, and she said this was bigger than they'd realized because these people had resources to fight back legally. She assigned 2 officers to park outside our safe house around the clock. That night I woke up to Claire shaking my shoulder and whispering that something was wrong because the officers hadn't checked in for their hourly report. She crept to the window and gasped when she saw both officers slumped over in their patrol car. Before we could call for help, the back door exploded inward with a crash, and 3 men in ski masks rushed into the kitchen. The biggest one pointed at me and said the kid comes with him or the aunt dies. Claire grabbed the pot of water she'd been boiling for tea and threw it at the first attacker's face while screaming at me to run. I snatched a knife from the counter and slashed at the second man's hand when he reached for me, opening a deep cut that sprayed blood across the white cabinets. The third man pulled out a gun and pointed it at Claire's head, saying enough. I needed to come quietly or he'd kill her right now. Sirens suddenly wailed from down the street because Claire had hit a silent alarm button under the kitchen counter when she'd first looked out the window. The men cursed and backed toward the door, but the one with the gun turned and said we couldn't hide forever because they knew where my mom lived in Arizona. They disappeared into the night just as the drugged officers in the car started moving, slowly waking up from whatever they'd been injected with. 3 days later, we were in an FBI safe house outside Riverside with armed guards at every door and window, while Agent Martinez explained that they'd frozen bank accounts and arrested 12 more people, but someone with deep pockets was paying for everyone's legal defense. The safe house was a plain 2-story building that looked normal from outside, but had bulletproof glass and reinforced walls, plus cameras covering every angle and motion sensors in the yard. Dr. Holloway arrived that afternoon with a medical team to document my injuries for the court case, taking photos of every scar and burn mark while dictating notes about compression fractures in 3 vertebrae and 40% hearing loss in my left ear from that explosion stunt. He was gentle as he examined each old injury injury, measuring the burn scars on my arms, and testing my range of motion in the ankle that never healed right, building what he called an ironclad medical case against Dad and the others. That night, I had the worst nightmare yet about falling from those warehouse platforms, except this time I didn't wake up before hitting the ground, just kept falling through the concrete into darkness until Claire shook me awake as I screamed. She held me while I shook and whispered that I was safe now, but we both knew that wasn't really true with Dad's friends still out there and their lawyers working to get everyone released on bail. The next morning, they brought Lucas and 2 other survivors to the safe house for a group interview with the prosecutors, including a 7-year-old girl named Emma who wouldn't speak at all, just sat there staring at her hands. Lucas looked worse than when I'd last seen him at the warehouse, with dark circles under his eyes as he explained how his father had filmed everything that happened at the warehouse events and sold the videos privately to collectors. He said there was a whole library of recordings going back 5 years showing kids who died during stunts, kids who got paralyzed, kids who lost limbs, all cataloged and sold to sick people who paid thousands for each video. The prosecutors took notes while Emma's foster mom held her, and another boy described how his parents had trained him to walk on hot coals until his feet were so scarred he couldn't feel anything anymore. We were all comparing injuries when Rachel burst in saying news of our location had leaked online and suspicious vehicles were approaching the safe house, which meant someone in law enforcement was feeding information to the circuit. The evacuation happened so fast, I barely grabbed my backpack before agents rushed us to unmarked cars, while I heard one agent tell another that they had a mole and couldn't trust anyone outside their core team anymore. During the drive to another location, Rachel got a call about David, the kid who'd been missing since the boat, and it turned out he was in a hospital under a fake name after jumping overboard and nearly drowning. His parents were already there with lawyers claiming he'd fallen from playground equipment, even though the doctors found salt water in his lungs and injuries consistent with a 30-foot fall into ocean waves. We'd been at the new safe house for maybe an hour when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered it was Mom, actually Mom, calling from Arizona where she'd been trying to find me for 2 years. She was crying as she explained that Dad had gotten a restraining order claiming she was harassing us, and she'd hired a private investigator, but Dad always stayed one step ahead by moving us around. Her voice broke when she asked about my injuries because the FBI had told her some of what happened, and she kept saying she was sorry for not protecting me, even though it wasn't her fault Dad had hidden everything. After we hung up, an agent showed me Dad's financial records on a laptop, pointing to deposits totaling over $10 million in the past 3 years, with money trails leading to offshore accounts in 12 countries. The agent explained that someone very powerful was protecting this whole operation, because normal underground crime doesn't have this level of financial sophistication and international reach. I was still trying to understand the scale of everything when news came that Vincent had been found dead in his cell, supposedly suicide, but the cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned for exactly the window when he died. Lucas went pale when he heard because Vincent was going to testify and knew all the names of the rich people who attended the warehouse events and paid for private videos. That night I was lying in bed at the safe house when the power suddenly cut out and emergency generators kicked in with a loud hum while we heard movement outside in the darkness. An agent whispered for us to get to the panic room immediately, and as we ran down the hallway, windows started shattering from suppressed gunfire while men in black tactical gear climbed through, clearly making a serious attempt to silence us before the trial. The agent shoved us through a hidden door behind a bookshelf into a small steel room with monitors covering one wall showing every angle of the house. 6 men in black gear moved through the halls with rifles raised while the agent grabbed his radio and called for backup. Claire pulled Emma against her chest while Lucas and I picked up baseball bats from a corner, knowing they were useless against guns but needing to hold something. Claire throwing boiling water at masked men while yelling "run" deserves some kind of award for quick thinking under pressure. Nothing says protective aunt quite like turning kitchen items into weapons while hitting secret alarm buttons. The monitors showed the intruders kicking down doors and tossing furniture aside, searching for us. One pointed at the bookshelf and started moving toward our hidden entrance when suddenly the front windows exploded inward and FBI agents in full tactical gear poured into the house. Gunfire erupted on the monitors as the 2 groups exchanged shots with furniture splintering and walls getting torn apart. The intruders tried retreating but got pinned down in the living room where SWAT officers surrounded them. 2 dropped their weapons and raised their hands while the others kept firing until tear gas filled the room. When the smoke cleared, all 6 intruders were on the ground in cuffs, and one agent pulled off a mask revealing a scarred face I recognized from news reports about military contractors. The agent with us got confirmation the house was secure and let us out past the damage where FBI vehicles filled the street. They loaded us into armored trucks and drove us straight to the federal courthouse downtown, where prosecutors were already waiting in a secure conference room. The lead prosecutor spread files across the table, showing us photos of the captured men who all had military backgrounds and now worked for private security firms. She explained these weren't random thugs, but professional operators who'd been hired by multiple warehouse spectators to eliminate witnesses. The case would take months or years to prosecute because the defendants had unlimited legal resources and connections throughout the justice system. They moved us to a secure wing of the federal building, with guards posted at every entrance and no windows facing the street. Lucas and I shared a room with 2 beds and a small bathroom, where we tried to process what had just happened. That night, he sat on his bed and pulled off his shirt, showing me his back for the first time. Words were carved into his skin in jagged letters that had healed into thick white scars reading, "Property of HB," with numbers underneath. He explained 5 other kids from the circuit had similar brands marking them as pre-sold to specific buyers who'd paid deposits years in advance. The next morning, Dr. James went before a grand jury with boxes of medical evidence including x-rays of our broken bones and photos documenting every scar and burn. He showed them psychological evaluations describing trauma patterns consistent with systematic torture over extended periods. Several jurors started crying when he displayed images of the youngest victims, while Dad's lawyer kept objecting that the evidence was prejudicial. The judge overruled every objection and let James continue presenting proof of what had been done to us. 2 weeks later, we got word that Officer Martinez had made bail and immediately drove to the hospital where Claire worked as a nurse. Security stopped him at the entrance, but he stood in the parking lot shouting threats about how his connections in the system would protect him. He yelled that our testimony wouldn't matter because he knew judges who understood that parents had the right to discipline their children however they wanted. Claire had to get a police escort home that night, while the FBI added more agents to our protection detail. That same week, agents raided a warehouse in Nevada after getting a tip about another active circuit operating there. They rescued 14 kids ranging from 5 to 16 years old, who all showed injuries matching ours with burns and breaks and scars. The parents got arrested, but most of the wealthy spectators had already fled the country when word spread about our case. 3 days later, my mom showed up at the courthouse after driving from Oregon, where she'd been hiding for the past 7 years. Seeing her felt unreal because she looked so much older with gray in her hair and deep lines around her eyes. She brought boxes of legal documents showing she'd tried to get custody dozens of times, but Dad's connections had blocked every attempt. She'd hired lawyers and private investigators and even contacted the FBI years ago, but nobody would listen to her claims about the abuse. During our 3rd week at the courthouse, Emma finally started talking in a therapy session with a child psychologist the FBI had brought in. She whispered that she'd been recruited from foster care after her foster parents saw an ad promising big money for kids who could perform. They'd told her she was joining a real circus and would become famous, but instead sold her for $50,000. The therapist looked physically sick, taking notes while Emma described the training they'd put her through before her first warehouse performance. Detective Rachel had been tracking financial records and finally found the main money source behind everything. A billionaire named Harrison Blackwood, who owned casinos in multiple countries, had been funding the entire operation as entertainment for his wealthy friends. He lived in a country without extradition treaties, but his U.S. assets included hotels and businesses worth billions that the government immediately froze. The FBI started seizing his properties, while forensic accountants traced payments to identify more people involved in financing the circuit. 3 weeks later, I sat in the courthouse waiting room with Claire, while my hands shook so bad I couldn't hold the water cup steady. The pre-trial hearing for Dad and the other parents was starting in 20 minutes, and Detective Torres had warned me they'd all be there in person. I hadn't seen Dad since the rescue, and my whole body felt cold knowing he'd be in the same room. Claire kept rubbing my back, but nothing helped the sick feeling in my stomach. When they called us in, I walked through the metal detectors and saw him sitting at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit with his lawyer. His eyes found mine immediately, and the hate in them made me freeze until the bailiff guided me to my seat behind the prosecutor. The judge started reading charges, and Dad kept turning around to stare at me with this look that said he wanted to kill me. When they got to the part about child endangerment resulting in permanent injury, Dad suddenly jumped up and lunged toward me, screaming that I destroyed everything. The bailiffs grabbed him, but not before he got close enough that I could see the veins bulging in his neck as he yelled that I'd never be safe. They dragged him out while he kept screaming threats, and the judge immediately revoked his bail, but the damage was done because I couldn't stop shaking for the rest of the hearing. 2 days later, Detective Torres called to tell me Lucas's father had taken a plea deal and was giving them information about the international operations. She said he revealed there were circuits in 15 countries, and the U.S. operation was actually small compared to what was happening in Eastern Europe and Asia. The FBI was sharing the information with Interpol, but most of the organizers lived in countries that wouldn't extradite them. By the 2nd month, Claire and I started looking at schools in other states because I couldn't handle being in California anymore. She kept saying we needed a fresh start, but every time I saw a warehouse or heard about gymnastics on TV, I was right back on those platforms 30 feet in the air. Normal life felt impossible when I'd wake up screaming from nightmares about falling or see Dad's face everywhere I went. The only thing that helped was group therapy with the other survivors, where we didn't have to explain our nightmares to each other. Emma, the 7-year-old from that final night, would draw pictures during our sessions of the warehouse, but she'd add wings to all the children so we could fly away. Her therapist said it was her way of taking back control, but it just made me cry seeing how she was trying to make sense of what happened to us. When the first trial started for Vincent's associates, I had to testify via closed-circuit TV from another room because I couldn't be in the same space as them. I described the betting system and how spectators would request specific injuries, showing the jury my scars and explaining which stunts caused each one. The defense lawyers tried to paint us as willing participants who knew the risks, but then the prosecutor played the videos and you could hear the defendants cheering when kids got hurt. 3 of them changed their pleas to guilty that same day. During the 3rd month, Harrison Blackwood's lawyers filed injunctions trying to stop the government from seizing his assets, claiming they couldn't prove the money came from illegal activities. At the hearing, a woman in the gallery suddenly stood up screaming that her daughter was on the videos they'd found. She threw herself at Blackwood's lawyer before the bailiffs restrained her, and I recognized her as the mother of a girl who died 2 years ago in what everyone thought was a gymnastics accident. The judge maintained the asset freeze and ordered a full investigation into every death that might be connected to the circuit. Detective Torres called me that week with news about David, the boy who'd been in a coma since his fall. He'd finally woken up but couldn't speak because the psychological trauma had left him mute. His parents were refusing to let him testify and kept saying he needed to move on, but when child services found out they were still in contact with circuit organizers, they immediately intervened. Mom filed her custody petition the same week Dad's parental rights were officially terminated. The family court judge spent hours reviewing all the documentation Mom had gathered over the years trying to protect me. She told the court about every time she'd tried to report Dad's behavior and been dismissed, showing receipts for private investigators she'd hired and letters she'd written begging for help. The judge acknowledged her persistence and said it was clear she'd never stopped fighting for me. Blackwood owning casinos makes me wonder if he used gambling connections to find other rich people who wanted to bet on kids getting hurt. How did Torres track all that money through different countries and businesses? Claire testified that she'd help both of us heal and had already set up therapy appointments and enrolled me in a new school. A few days later, Lucas and I went to visit David in the hospital. We sat with him in silence for a long time, understanding why he couldn't talk about what happened. Then David picked up a whiteboard and wrote that they'd told him if he talked, they'd take his little sister next. Lucas grabbed the board and wrote back that we'd already told the FBI about the threats and his sister was safe. David started crying and wrote more names of kids whose families were being threatened to stay quiet. We gave everything to Detective Torres, who immediately put protection details on 5 more more families. By the 4th month, the FBI raids on Blackwood's U.S. properties were turning up more evidence than anyone expected. They found hard drives with thousands of hours of footage from multiple countries going back 20 years. The agent who briefed us looked sick when he said they'd identified hundreds of children in the videos and were working with international agencies to track them down. Some of the kids in the oldest videos were adults now and had never told anyone what happened to them. International warrants were being issued, but everyone knew most of the perpetrators would never face justice because they'd hidden in countries that protected them. 3 weeks later, I sat in the courtroom watching Dad's lawyer stand up and tell everyone I was making it all up for attention. He brought in some psychiatrist who'd never even met me, and the guy started talking about something called false memory syndrome. The prosecutor jumped up yelling objections while the judge banged her gavel. They wheeled in a TV and played our videos right there in court. I watched the jury members' faces go white as they saw kids breaking bones and screaming. One woman covered her mouth and ran out to throw up. Dad just sat there staring straight ahead like he was watching paint dry. 2 days after that, Lucas called me crying because the officer who'd helped rescue us was dead. They found him in his apartment with an overdose of the same drugs they'd used on us kids. The cops called it suicide, but Lucas and I both knew better. We were sitting in my aunt's kitchen when he said they were cleaning house and getting rid of witnesses. That same week, Emma got adopted by one of the detectives who worked our case. At the placement ceremony, she grabbed my hand and whispered that she still dreamed about falling every night. I hugged her tight and told her I did too, but at least we survived. The next month, Mom finally came to visit me at Aunt Claire's house. She sat on the couch twisting her hands while she told me how Dad changed over the years. She said he started with small risks at first, then kept pushing things further and further. She should have seen it sooner, she said, but by then she was crying too hard to talk. That afternoon, 3 more circuit parents took plea deals in exchange for information. They told the prosecutors about a whole network that targeted families with money problems or custody fights. One parent testified they specifically looked for desperate parents who had athletic kids. The news went crazy when Blackwood got arrested in Switzerland and started fighting extradition. His lawyers claimed the videos were just performance art and no real children got hurt. A bunch of survivor families held a press conference the next day. Parents lifted their kids' shirts to show scars and burns and missing fingers. The whole world saw what the circuit really did to us. Public outrage exploded across every country and protests started outside embassies. Dr. Holloway called me that week to say he was opening a special treatment center just for circuit survivors. He explained it would have physical therapy and counseling and tutoring all in one place. The government was seizing circuit money to pay for everything. A month later, I started going to regular school for the first time in 2 years. Normal kids complained about homework while I was still testifying in federal court every week. My math teacher noticed my limp and asked if I needed special accommodations. I didn't know how to explain that algebra seemed pretty easy after surviving death stunts. Lucas turned 18 that month and moved into his own apartment with a social worker checking on him. He told me he was going to become a social worker himself to help kids like us. His missing fingers didn't slow him down when he filled out college applications. The next week, we all got called back to the courthouse because the federal judge was getting death threats. Security guards with guns stood at every door, and they tripled the metal detectors. The judge stood up and announced that this case would proceed no matter what. She said justice would not be intimidated by anyone. 8 months passed before Dad's trial finally reached closing arguments, and the prosecutor was laying out all the evidence when Dad suddenly stood up from the defense table. The bailiffs moved toward him, but he raised his hands and said he wanted to confess everything. He claimed Blackwood's organization had forced him to provide children and threatened to kill our whole family if he didn't cooperate. The prosecutor pulled out phone records showing Dad had contacted them first, emails where he pitched me as a performer, bank statements showing deposits before any supposed threats. Dad's face went white as she read his own words describing how much money he could make off his trained child. The jury left to deliberate, and we waited in a secure room for 3 days while they decided. Lucas sat next to me with his missing fingers drumming on the table, while Emma stared at the wall, and David still hadn't spoken a single word since the boat. When the clerk finally called us back, the foreman stood and read guilty on all 27 counts. Dad didn't react at all, just stared at me with these empty eyes like he was already gone. 2 months later at sentencing, the judge gave him life without parole, and as the guards led him away in chains, he mouthed something that looked like sorry, but I felt nothing, because whatever father I might have loved had died years before this moment. 3 months after that, Blackwood finally got extradited from Switzerland, and the federal agent handling the case warned us his trial would be the biggest fight yet. He had unlimited money and connections everywhere, and they offered us witness protection, but we said no, because we weren't going to hide forever. The evidence we'd gathered started exposing more circuits internationally, and over the next few weeks, 60 children got rescued from 7 different countries. Each rescue brought relief, but also this crushing guilt about all the ones we didn't save, all the kids still out there performing for monsters. David finally broke his silence during a therapy session 6 months later, screaming about the boat and the water, and how he jumped overboard rather than perform a stunt designed to snap his spine. His parents got arrested that same day for accepting $100,000 for his participation. Mom and I packed up and moved to a small town in Washington State with new names and a new school where nobody knew our story. I still checked every exit when I entered a room and flinched when people moved too fast, but the therapist said recovery wasn't a destination. It was something you did every single day. 13 months after everything started, I joined the track team at my new school because running helped me feel in control of my own body again. My coach noticed my limp from the shattered ankle, but never pushed me past what felt safe and told me to run whatever pace felt right. Lucas sent me a letter saying he'd started college to study social work like he promised, and included a photo of himself on campus with a real smile on his face. He wrote that some days were harder than others, but we were living proof that survival was possible even after the worst things imaginable. When Blackwood's trial finally started, the media coverage was everywhere, and I testified through a video link from a secure location. I described the warehouse and the bedding and the crowds cheering while children broke their bones for entertainment. His lawyer tried to make me look like a liar, but the videos we'd taken were right there showing everything I described. Even the people on his own legal team looked sick when they watched the footage of kids screaming while rich men threw money at their injuries. 15 months into the trials, the prosecutor called a surprise witness nobody expected. unexpected. A woman in her 30s walked into the courtroom, and every reporter started typing because she looked exactly like the main organizer sitting at the defendant's table. She took the stand and explained she was his daughter, and 20 years ago she'd been his first victim in a smaller version of the circuit. The whole courtroom went silent when she described how he'd started with just her in their basement, then realized he could make money letting other people watch. She had burn scars on her arms just like mine, and when she rolled up her sleeves to show them, the organizer put his head in his hands. The prosecutor asked her why she was coming forward now, and she said watching the trial coverage made her realize how many kids he'd hurt after her. She testified for 3 hours about the early days of the circuit and how her father had recruited other parents by showing them videos of what he'd done to her. When she finished testifying, she walked past his table without looking at him and sat in the gallery with the other survivors. The verdict came 2 days later, and the judge read guilty on every single federal charge. The organizer got 7 consecutive life sentences plus 300 years, and as the bailiffs led him away in chains, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not happiness exactly, but like I could finally take a full breath without that weight pressing down. The timing of all these guilty parents suddenly wanting to confess and cooperate feels awfully convenient, doesn't it? Especially Dad's dramatic courtroom confession, claiming he was forced when the prosecutor had clear proof he started everything himself. A week later, I got a package from Emma, one of the younger kids from the circuit who'd been relocated to Oregon. Inside was a drawing she'd made showing all of us circuit kids with angel wings flying above a burning warehouse. At the bottom, she'd written in crayon that we were free now and could fly wherever we wanted. I framed it and hung it above my desk as a reminder that we'd all survived and become protectors of each other. 3 months later, Dr. Holloway invited me to speak at his treatment center to a group of new survivors who'd been rescued from a different ring. I sat in a circle with 8 kids aged 10 to 16 and told them the nightmares would get quieter over time. Not silent, but quieter. A boy with burn scars covering half his face nodded because he understood what adults couldn't, that survival gets measured in small victories like sleeping through the night or not flinching when someone raises their hand. Mom started coming to therapy with me, and we joined a support group for parents and children processing this kind of trauma together. During one session, another mother mentioned my dad's name and how he'd tried recruiting her family into the circuit 5 years ago. Mom broke down crying and kept saying she should have killed him when she had the chance, that she'd failed me by not seeing what was happening. The therapist had to remind her that self-blame wouldn't change the past, but Mom couldn't stop shaking. 6 months later, I decided to visit Dad in federal prison one last time. He'd aged 20 years in 2 years, and his eyes looked hollow when the guards brought him to the visiting room. He started talking about being sick, about the videos and the excitement making him lose control, but I cut him off. I told him he'd been conscious and aware during every single thing he did to me, and he'd chosen money over his child. I left without looking back and told the guards to take me off his visitor list permanently. The final circuit trials wrapped up 8 months later with 47 total convictions and thousands of years in combined sentences. They demolished the main warehouse in a ceremony where survivors could speak if they wanted, but I stayed silent because watching the wrecking ball destroy that place said everything I needed to say. David, the boy who'd been sold by his foster parents, started speaking at government hearings about reforming the foster system. He told committees how the people meant to protect him had sold him for entertainment, and within weeks, new oversight policies started getting implemented. 2 years after my escape, I still had nightmares, but I also had tools to handle them like therapy and medication and a support network of other survivors who understood. The scars on my body would always be there, but they'd become part of my story instead of my whole identity. Then the news broke that 3 circuit organizers who'd fled to Southeast Asia had been arrested in a joint operation between 5 countries. The FBI agent called to tell me it was really over, that the entire network had been destroyed and nobody was left to restart it. I hung up the phone and sat in my apartment looking at Emma's drawing of us flying free, and for the first time since I was 8 years old, I felt safe. The nightmares still came sometimes, but now I had tools to handle them, breathing exercises and grounding techniques that Dr. Holloway taught me during our weekly sessions. Time moved differently now, marked by therapy appointments and court dates instead of scheduled stunts, and slowly the days turned into weeks, then months, then years. My body healed in stages, the burns fading to pink scars, the limp becoming less pronounced with physical therapy, though the hearing loss in my left ear stayed permanent. I went back to school, sitting in regular classrooms with kids who complained about homework while I relearned how to hold a pencil with fingers that had been broken twice. The other students stared at my scars at first, but eventually I became just another kid in the hallway, which felt like the biggest victory. 3 years passed before I could walk across that graduation stage, my cap covering the scar on my scalp, my gown hiding most of the burn marks, but the limp was still there as I crossed to get my diploma. Mom sat in the front row crying, Aunt Claire cheering louder than anyone, and for the first time I had a future that Dad couldn't touch or control or sell to the highest bidder. Lucas graduated too, got his social work degree, and immediately started working for Child Protective Services, telling his supervisor he knew exactly what signs to look for that other adults missed. He'd already identified 3 kids in suspicious situations during his internship, getting them help before their parents could escalate to anything worse. Emma sent me videos from her new life, performing in a real circus with actual safety equipment and trainers who cared if she got hurt, laughing on the trapeze in a way we never could back then. The government finally established a compensation fund, using all the seized assets from the circuit organizers, providing lifetime medical care and therapy for every survivor they could locate. It wasn't enough to erase what happened, but it was acknowledgement that we existed, that what was done to us mattered, that someone finally saw us as more than entertainment. I started college studying journalism, my admissions essay about survival getting me a full scholarship, though the admissions officer had to leave the room after reading it because she couldn't stop crying. Mom and I moved into a small house with a backyard where we planted tomatoes and flowers, working in the soil with our hands, growing something beautiful from nothing, learning how to live normal lives. The documentary crew contacted me about participating in their film about the trials, and watching the footage again made my hands shake, but I did it anyway because people needed to know this happened. At the treatment center's 5th anniversary gathering, hundreds of survivors showed up, all of us different now, teachers and social workers and advocates, or just people living quiet lives far from warehouses and spotlights. Dr. Holloway gave a speech about transformation, how we'd turned our trauma into purpose, though most of us were just trying to get through each day without flinching at sudden movements. I wrote my first article about survival for the college paper, and it went viral overnight. Messages pouring in from other survivors of different traumas, all of us connected by the simple fact that we'd endured things children shouldn't have to endure. The final meeting happened 5 years after my escape. Lucas and Emma and David and me sitting on a beach watching the sunset. None of us the same kids who'd performed in those warehouses. David could speak clearly now after years of speech therapy, saying, "We made it," while Emma drew patterns in the sand with her good hand, and Lucas skipped stones with his remaining fingers. I wrote it all down in my journal, not for evidence anymore, but just to remember, to document that we were more than what was done to us, that some things can't be broken, only transformed into something different. The sun went down, and we stayed there on the beach. 4 kids who'd survived the unsurvivable, who'd found each other in the darkness, and held on until we reached the light. Proof that even the worst stories can have endings worth fighting for. Alright, that's gonna wrap it up for this one. Appreciate you hanging out and letting me throw in my 2 cents along the way. It's been a ride. Like the video, it helps more than you think.